As promised, we're back to rank all of the items in the DLC Seekers of the Storm, since they've all been reworked, and guess what? They're all broken now. Technically, I'm going to be ranking them, but also it's a tier list as well. A real bang for your buck video. Now, I usually don't do this, but I'm going to try this time and see how it works. But I'm going to explain the metrics I'm using for ranking these items. That way, if I rank anything inconsistently, you guys can really grill me in the comments. So you can skip this part of the video if you don't actually care, and just want another Watch Mojo video, that's totally fair. I watch them all the time. Number 5 will shock you. Anyway, here's the methodology I'm using to rank these items. First, we got to look at its power. How powerful is an item on the overall gameplay? If I pick up this item and it wipes the entire map, that's a pretty powerful item, but we have to combine this with accessibility and versatility. In other words, how easy is it for that effect to occur, and how useful that scenario is in most situations. For example, if I can only wipe the map after I do a Bernie's typing travel and have over 200 words per minute, its accessibility is going to be very low, considering I peck at my keyboard like an old man. On top of that, we need to look at how the item synergizes with other items in Survivors. Aegis, for example, notoriously one of the worst items in the game, only works if you have healing. Or Pocket ICBM, which is a good item, but requires you to have a missile item or a missile ability. And finally, stacking. Not just in how good it is when it stacks, but how good it is compared to the rarity it's at. For example, if a red item needs several stacks to be useful, then it's not useful because red items are so rare. Likewise, if a white item only needs 1 stack to be very useful, that's going to be bonus points for that item as well. But because white items are so common, and even the 3D printers are going to be more common for white items, an item like a tri-tip dagger, which needs multiple stacks for it to be really effective, is still a very strong item just because you can usually get a couple stacks. So hopefully that explains everything. If I'm not consistent with this ranking methodology, or you think there's some discrepancies between what I believe and what the truth is, you can roast me in the comments, that's fine. If you want to see what the items did before the rework, you can check out my old tier list, the definitive item tier list for the Seekers of the Storm DLC, that explains in pretty good detail what all the items did. Starting out with the worst item in the Seekers of the Storm DLC, we have Warped Echo. And when I say Warped Echo is the worst item, I still put it in A tier, by the way. Here's how it works. The next source of damage is reduced by 30% and spread into 3 + 1 per stack hits. All echo damage is non-lethal except for the final hit, recharges every 15 seconds. Minus 3% per stack. Enter in yet another bubble defensive item, the others being safer spaces and oddly shaped opal. And if you compare Warped Echo to the other defensive items, it's actually weaker. 1 stack of opal giving you 50% damage reduction. Safer spaces blocking the damage altogether. And while Safer Spaces has the same cooldown as Warped Echo, oddly shaped opal with its 50% damage reduction on 1 stack has half the cooldown. So compared to the other defensive items that function similarly, where you get hit and then it goes on cooldown, it is technically outperformed in defense. However, the rest of the item is actually very interesting. Not only are the lethal hits non-lethal, meaning that you can ignore all the damage you take until the last hit and then heal up, effectively negating all the damage. So if you, for example, had a foreign fruit, you could ignore all of the non-lethal hits and wait until that last tick of damage that's about to kill you, then use the foreign fruit and be completely fine. On top of that, all of the echoed hits don't count as being in danger. So even though you're still technically taking damage, as long as you don't take another hit from a different enemy, items like Cautious Slug or Personal Shield Generator will still recharge even if you're taking Warped Echo damage. Medkit also works, but it will only work on the first hit. Also, Repulsion Armor, Tougher Times, and Planula will not work on all the echoed hits either. Although, interestingly enough, Roll of Pennies and Razor Wire do work. So Warped Echo actually increases the effectiveness of these 2 items. A couple more things to note about this item that's very important. 1, you can't dodge any of the damage. The wiki has said this every single version of this item, and it's not true, it's fake news. Try it yourself, run Mercenary with Eviscerate, and guess what? You will not be able to dodge any of the damage, especially the lethal one. If you're in an iframe ability, you will still die from that last hit. Second, the ticks are actually in 0.75 second intervals. They're not quite 1 second, which is a little rough. And the Warped Echo cooldown goes down while you're getting hit by the Warped Echo. So if you have enough stacks, don't worry, it probably won't happen. You need a lot of stacks, like over 20, I think. Your Warped Echo will actually be off cooldown before the lethal hits are finished. This will add to the counter on the Warped Echo, and any damage you take in this time won't kill you. However, there will still be a lethal hit in the middle of that. So to elaborate, because that probably wasn't the best explanation, if you have enough Warped Echoes that you're about to take 10 hits of damage and the 10th one is the lethal one, but your Warped Echo comes off cooldown, and let's say for the sake of simplicity it adds another 10 hits, so you have 20, the 10th hit will still be a lethal hit, and the 20th hit will also be a lethal hit. It won't reset it so that it's only the 20th hit. Very niche scenario, but it's good to know. So the Warped Echo is actually a terrific item. It's bottom of A tier for me, and technically the worst item in Seekers of the Storm in my most basic general tier list. The Warped Echo is one of those complex items that needs a lot of explaining, so don't expect every section to be that long. Next up, we have Luminous Shot. Activating your secondary skill stores up to 5 charges plus 1 per stack requires 3 charges for your primary skill to fire lightning strikes, dealing 175% total damage plus 50% per stack each. It reduces secondary skill cooldown by 20%. There's been a lot of improvements on Luminous Shot since the previous version. The most important thing being, instead of just doing base damage like it did before, now it does total damage and has a proc coefficient, which means it can proc other items. The first stack of Luminous Shot at max charges should give you 875% damage, which is multiplied by your primary attack. So if you have a strong primary, this is going to do more damage. And of course, having a cooldown reduction on your secondary skill is also amazing. And a little bonus, if you do kill something with the lightning strike, you get like 10% bonus XP, which isn't that much, but hey, it's better than nothing. Luminous Shot is another one of those items where it's like, on certain survivors, it might as well be the best item in the game. On other survivors, it might as well be meh. The previous version of this item had a bug where if you had the charges and then used your primary but didn't hit an enemy, whatever your next ability was, if it hit an enemy, would use the Luminous Shot charges. That no longer exists, so it truly is based off of your primary damage. That means for this item to be good on a survivor, your primary has to do decent amount of damage, and your secondary has to be at least somewhat spammable. That being said, almost every survivor is going to want 20% cooldown reduction on their secondary and extra bonus damage whenever they use it. For example, Commando's secondary is one of his best abilities, so obviously he's going to want it even though his primary only does 100% damage. And even Engineer, who you'd think it'd be weak on, can still fully charge it all the way just with his base amount of spider mines. Ironically, and this might be a little bit of a shocker to you, but Railgunner is really bad with it. This is because even though she can get her charges very quickly, the only way for the Luminous Shot to activate is if she uses her unscoped M1, which only does 100% damage, and it can't even crit. So sadly, it's actually pretty bad on her. There are 2 survivors though that it's unbelievably broken on: the False Sun and Multi. Obviously the False Sun because you can get an insane amount of charges for your secondary, but Club of the Forsaken, which does 1500% damage, counts towards being a primary attack. This is without a doubt an S tier item if we're just talking about the False Sun, because it's an item basically made for him. And as for Multi, there's a super cheesy way to use Luminous Shot where you run power mode and you put your power saw on the secondary slot. And once you're in power mode, all you have to do is tap power saw as fast as you can and you'll charge up Luminous Shot. So you can run Power Saw and Rebar Puncher and have an extremely effective build with Luminous Shot, since Rebar Puncher is doing 600% damage. You should go check out my loadout videos to know the best loadouts to run on everybody. Just saying, it's good. So yes, Luminous Shot is very good. It's way better than it used to be, and it synergizes well with a lot of common items. For example, Backup Mag is made even better with this item. Not only are you getting more bang for your buck from the cooldown reduction you get from Luminous Shot, but with just 2 backup magazines, you can immediately charge up Luminous Shot. And once again, it can now proc items. It does total damage, so it gets even better with more proc items, putting it in the A tier right above Warped Echo. Next, we have Prayer Beads, which didn't change at all really, but they fixed the bugs for it. Grows by gaining experience, storing 20% plus 5% per item stack bonus stats, which are health, regeneration, and damage. On removal, gain all stored stats. For starters, here's how the item actually works, just to clarify. All characters in the game, even enemies, gain 30% of their base HP per level and 20% of their damage and regen per level. So for Commando, who has 12 damage, each level he gains 2.4. Sadly, Prayer Beads does not actually give you 2.4 per level stored. Honestly, that would probably be a little broken. Instead, it gives you 20% and obviously plus 5% per stack of that 2.4. So for Commando, this would be 0.48. In other words, in 1 stack of Prayer Beads, it takes you 5 stored levels in the Prayer Beads to give you 1 level's worth of damage. This might not sound that good on paper, but because of how XP requirements scale for each level, eventually you'll stagnate somewhere around the 30 range, I think, even on 2-hour plus runs, which means you're effectively capped out of getting any more stats to increase your base damage. And because a new stack of Prayer Beads functions like you were just at level 1, so they level up quickly, assuming you have no other Prayer Beads in your inventory, that means you can usually get like 20 levels out of a single Prayer Beads, scrap it, and then pick up another one, reset, and do it again. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but you don't really want to stack this item that much. You want to pick one up and get as far as you can, maybe level 20 or something, then pick up another one so it's easier to get the levels. If that's not possible, it's okay to stack them. If you, for example, don't have a scrap around a map but you see another Prayer Beads, you can pick it up. It's going to give you extra stats, but it's just not as efficient. And because they removed Prayer Bead printers, this item is going to be a lot less common. Thankfully, they fixed the bug where everything was calculated after you removed them from your inventory. So for example, if you went to scrap 5 prayer beads, when you scrap them, it would give you the stats based off of -1 prayer beads because you have 0 in your inventory. That's fixed and you should get the appropriate amount now. There are also 2 interactions that make the prayer beads even better. Number 1, growth nectar works with prayer beads in 2 different ways. One is that obviously if you have the buff with prayer beads on the side, that counts towards growth nectar. But number 2, all the stats you get from prayer beads is multiplied by growth nectar. So just 1 growth nectar at max stacks, which is 28%, gives you 28% more stats from prayer beads. It works the same way with tonic. So while you have spinal tonic activated, you have 100% increased damage from prayer beads. The sad thing is this doesn't interact with chronic expansion at all, which is the only downside. And growth nectar plus tonic plus prayer beads also doesn't interact with chronic expansion. And also you have to think about it like this, the prayer beads is a free item that gives you stats. What I mean is, to get the benefit from prayer beads, you actually have to scrap it, which turns it into green scrap, which you could then put into another item. It's like you're getting paid to drive a car, but soon as you don't want the money anymore, you can trade it in for a Ferrari. It's a pretty sweet deal, and it synergizes with basically every item in the game, because it increases all your base stats, so anything that says base damage is also increased by prayer beads. And again, because you can only gain so many levels in a single run, except if you have long-standing solitude, more to come on that later, that's what she said, you get the benefit of leveling up without having to deal with Risk of Rain 2's logarithmic scale for leveling. Obviously, it's very situational and sometimes hard to use. You have to rely on there being a scrapper, and because it's an uncommon item, you're not going to see it that often. So that's why it's lower on the tier list, even though it's a pretty good item. Just A tier above Luminous Shot, a little far down from its S tier, last ranking. Next, we have Bolstering Lantern. I love me some Bolstering Lantern. It is essentially Focus Crystal, but for attack speed. Increase your attack speed by 10% for up to 4 plus 2 per stack enemies and allies within 20 plus 5 per stack meters. You'll have a little blue outline around you showing you where the AoE is, similar to Focus Crystal. However, unlike Focus Crystal, it actually counts allies as well. So survivors, like Engineer, are going to have a better time with it. And in multiplayer, it's going to be even better. Although your friends are probably running off to steal your chest, so they're not going to be near you that often. Which is why you should always play with Artifact of Chaos on. This also makes it more worth it to have drones, although their AI is a little bit wonky, so they're not always near you. Just 1 stack of Bolstering Lantern at maximum effectiveness, which is the 4 stacks, is almost the same as having 3 Soldier Syringes. Bolstering Lantern giving you 40% and Soldier Syringes, 3 of them, giving you 45%. Still, because it's kind of situational, there have to be enemies in the range, and because the stacking of it isn't actually that good, I can't put it too much higher than where it is right now, because even though by stacking it you get more attack speed, the plus 2 per stack means you get 20%. However, there needs to be more and more enemies per stack that you get. And while the radius does increase, because of how math works, the radius isn't actually increasing by that much per stack, and it becomes harder and harder to increase the general size of the circle. And obviously, in certain situations, you're not going to be able to use the full effectiveness of Bolstering Lantern, like for example, if you're fighting Mithrix. With the caveat being, Engineer can use it whenever he wants because he has turrets. But if you're a friendless homunculi who plays Commando and you're trying to fight Mithrix, it's not going to be as effective as just having more Soldier Syringes. So we're keeping it in the A tier, slightly above Prayer Beads. Next up, we have Chance Doll. I love the Chance Doll. Here's how the Chance Doll works. On Shrine of Chance success, 40% plus 10% per stack chance to get higher rarity items. Now, it actually does not increase the rarity of the item. It's not going to upgrade whatever item you are about to get. Instead, it chooses from a different loot pool, which has a greater chance for legendaries and even possibly having boss items. The Chance Doll loot table has a 0% chance for white items, 79% chance for green items, 20% for legendaries, 1% for bosses, 0% for equipments. I explained most of this in the item tier list video from the first one. You can go watch that if you want. But to recap, essentially because of how the credit system works in Risk of Rain 2 and Chance Shrines being really good at giving you multiple items and being efficient for the credit system, Chance Dolls just make your runs better. They're usually the difference between having 1, maybe 2 legendary items by the end of the run versus having 6. So solid A tier above Bolstering Lantern. Next up, we have Electric Boomerang. Now, Electric Boomerang is a little weird and highly situational. 15% chance on hit to fire an electric boomerang that travels a short distance before returning, dealing 30% plus 30% per stack damage and stunning all enemies hit. Now, this boomerang shoots out directly in front of you and doesn't shoot out super far. Because of this, survivors like Huntress, where you're not always looking at an enemy, won't be able to benefit from it as much. However, survivors like Commando, who are basically always looking at the enemies they're shooting, and obviously proc more items, is going to benefit from this more. And obviously Engineer is also very good with electric boomerang, just saying. Also, the sombering bug that was supposed to be patched was not patched. It in fact still applies bleed if you're holding a sombering in your equipment slot. Also, because of how stuns work since the update, stuns now stacking instead of just applying and reapplying themselves. You'll often get this weird interaction when you're stunning things with boomerang, where they just sit there and it looks like their AI is completely broken. They're not actually broken, the boomerang just reapplied its stun like 5 times. So it's also very useful for that. On top of that, it has a 1.0 proc coefficient when it hits the first time, and when it returns is a 0.2. So effectively, if you hit it twice, you have a 1.2 proc coefficient, and it can proc items a lot. So survivors that can shoot fast, proc items, and stay at about medium range, the electric boomerang is going to be better for them, actually a very good item on them. Whereas survivors like Railgunner, who's going to be 10,000 feet away and isn't rapidly firing like a commando, although they could, I guess, doesn't get as much value out of an electric boomerang. Still good though. Above Chance Doll in the A tier. Next up, we have Chronic Expansion. Killing enemy increases your damage by 3.5% plus 1% per stack up to 10 plus 5 per stack for 7 seconds. Dealing damage refreshes the timer. Again, this was a pretty substantial rework, but essentially from the previous version, instead of having to kill 5 enemies to get a damage buff, now you only have to kill 1, and instead of it being able to scale infinitely, it can only scale to whatever the max stacks are. And on top of that, because Chronic Expansion, the previous version, was only adding damage based off of your level 1 damage, so if you were a commando, it would be adding the whatever percentage it was times the 12, no matter what level you were or how much damage you were doing from other items like Delicate Watch or whatever. Sadly, it does not work at all with prayer beads, so all the extra damage you get with prayer beads will not be multiplied by the Chronic Expansion, and Shaped Glass also does not work. That being said, Spinal Tonic definitely works with it, so you can have the Tonic and Chronic build, aka the Snoop Dogg build, and I believe that Growth Nectar also does work with it as well. Keep in mind, if you're going to be running the Spinal Tonic build with Chronic Expansion, having Tonic Afflictions will mess with how much damage the Chronic gives you. Also, and I cannot emphasize this enough, you don't need to kill enemies to keep the buff going. It refreshes as you deal damage to enemies. It's not as big of a deal anymore because of how it works now, with 1 kill giving you more damage, but it's important to max out the effectiveness of this item to always be hitting something. A nerf from the previous version, as you could always get infinite damage very easily, but now it just feels better and has a lot more quality of life in it. A tier. Next up, we have Noxious Thorn. Now, Noxious Thorn is a terrific AoE item and probably one of the better changes because it's also really fun to use. Gain 10% chance to bleed an enemy. On killing an enemy, transfer 33% of every debuff stack to one enemy, plus 1 per stack within 20 meters, plus 5 meters per stack. For starters, being able to get bleed from anything other than Tri-Tip Dagger and Shatter Spleen is awesome, but being able to transfer debuffs to enemies nearby is insanely amazing. And because it rounds up, that means even if there's only 1 stack of a debuff on an enemy, it will still transfer that 1 debuff to the next enemy. And on top of that, the timer of the debuff is refreshed to the enemy. So even if your bleed was about to expire and it transfers to a different enemy from the Noxious Thorn, it's going to refresh it. Pairing a Death Mark with Noxious Thorn is insanely good because the Death Mark will transfer to another enemy. So even if it's hard for you to proc Death Mark on multiple enemies, as long as you can get it on one enemy, you can keep transferring it to all the enemies nearby, which is just crazy. Getting this item on Accurate is some of the most fun you can have in the game. Poison or Blight. And because the damage over time effects are typically common items, so you'll probably see at least 1 during your run. And unlike Death Mark, which doesn't give you any debuffs when you pick up the item, Noxious Thorn comes built in with 10% bleed, meaning you can always use Noxious Thorn when you have it. Great item and lots of fun. A+. Next we have Breaching Fin, previously Knockback Fin. Grounded enemies hit with any skill are launched and stunned. Enemies hit while airborne are launched again up to 2 times, plus 1 per stack. Launched enemies take increased damage by 20% from all sources per launch, recharges after 10 seconds. As crazy as this sounds, this item works on bosses as well. The only thing that it can't launch up are flying enemies, and just 1 stack gives you a 60% damage bonus against those enemies. And for some reason, it also gives you 2 debuffs towards Death Mark. And it counts as a buff, so Growth Nectar works with it. And if you have an AoE ability, Knockback Fin will launch up all the enemies hit by that AoE. And it can be reset with Blast Shower. There's not too many complex mechanics with this item. It's just a really good item. Bonus damage works everywhere. Stuns enemies, can work on Mithrix. It has everything Knockback Fin wishes it had, but also just does it better. Great item, A tier. Runic Lens. Now, I don't even think they changed Runic Lens at all. I think they just changed the overspill thing, which is a funny meme for a while, which was just its description in the game. And then they also added quality of life effects to make it more obvious when the meteor was hitting. You can watch my original item tier list video and go to the Runic Lens section to see see exactly what it does, but I'll try to keep this brief since nothing really changed about it. 3% chance on hit to call a meteor strike, dealing 2000% base damage. Every 100% attack damage dealt increases the activation chance by 3% plus 3% per stack, and damage fall off by 150% plus 50% per stack. In layman terms, if you do little damage, less chance to proc and less damage. If you do big damage, massive chance to proc and massive damage. The most interesting thing about Runic Lens is that it can actually end up in a feedback loop where items will just keep procking it over and over and over. Typically, items are not supposed to be able to proc themselves more than once in a chain. So if you proc an ATG and then that ATG procs a ukulele, that ukulele can't proc an ATG. However, for Runic Lens, if you proc the meteor and the meteor procs an ATG, that ATG can proc another meteor. And the feedback loop keeps going and going, and because ATG has total damage, that means that the ATG will just get stronger and stronger. It's funny when you see it, and also extremely powerful. Survivors like False Sun and Railgunner, any survivor that does a lot of damage in one shot, is going to love Runic Lens, but Runic Lens loves everybody, so. The one downside with Runic Lens is that it does not seem to hit flying enemies that accurately. I think it can, it's just hard for it to do so. So that's a pretty big con to the item overall. Other than that, I love this item. A tier just above Breaching Fin. Next up, we have War Bonds. War Bonds was one of the biggest glow ups of all time. People love this item now. During boss events, 5 missiles bombard the area, dealing 2.5% plus 2.5% per stack of boss max health in damage. Before the boss event, gain additional missiles up to a maximum of 20 plus 5 per stack per 25 gold gained. Gold requirement scales over time. Anything that spawns that has an HP bar is a boss event. Aurelionite spawning, that counts as a boss event, the Alloyed Worship Unit, all phases of Mithrix, etc. Sadly, it does not care if they're invulnerable during that phase, so when Aurelionite first spawns, or when Mithrix is in phase 4, stealing your items and not being able to take damage, it'll still go off. The crazy thing about War Bonds is, while yes, that the first stack will give you a 50% damage to the teleporter boss, War Bonds can actually proc Kajaro's and Radal's bands as well, which means any combos of those items is just going to one-shot every boss. If you do kill all of the bosses before the missiles run out, it's just going to shoot at you, so you can use this to kill large groups of enemies very quickly. Oh, and people kept asking about this and saying that it did work with it, but Pocket ICBM does not work with War Bonds. The one massive downside to War Bonds is that it does not work with long-standing Solitude, so you can no longer gain extra missiles. You'll instead be stuck with the +5. I'm going to put this at the top of A tier, the best of A tier. The reason for this being, even though it's an incredibly strong item and helps with a lot of bosses, it does nothing for the rest of the run. It will only target bosses, and if you're struggling with other enemies, not just the bosses, War Bonds won't really do anything for you. An example of this might be if you're fighting the Alloyed Worship Unit, you get it to 50% HP, and now you just can't kill it because now it starts spamming its shield attack, and all of your damage was in War Bonds. So very strong, but highly situational by definition. Next up, we have Seed of Life. Think of Seed of Life as a Dio's but in the equipment slot. You can also use this to revive dead allies, so if you have any friends that die, you can use this to revive them. It then transforms into an item that's essentially shitty monster teeth. The hardest part of using this item is finding the friends to use it on. Otherwise, if you're playing solo, it'll automatically revive you just like a Dio's. I'd say this is probably better than Dio's because not only is it more common, I see like 3 or 4 of these each run, but it's also in an equipment slot, which oftentimes won't make or break a run unless you're specifically going for a build that works around your equipment. It can also save you from phase 4 Mithrix. During some of my God runs where Mithrix has like 1,000 different items and he kills me, usually I'll revive with Seed of Life and win the run. Also, the later you go in the runs, the more random stuff can happen to you, so it's always nice to have an extra life out there. I put it in S tier, at the very bottom. Next up, we have Elusive Antlers. Give me a moment. Okay. Increases movement speed by 7%, plus 7% per stack. Spawns orbs of energy nearby every 10 seconds, minus 10% per stack, giving 12% movement speed up to 3 plus 1 per stack times for 12 seconds. Just saying, better if it reflected damage. Elusive Antlers is without a doubt the best movement speed item in the game. You just have to look at the stats that it gives you to really know that. It gives you a flat 7%, and if you pick up all of the orbs at just 1 stack, you can get 43% movement speed. And every extra stack of Elusive Antlers gives you the chance to get 19% bonus movement speed, and makes it even easier to collect the orbs which give you the bonus movement speed. So all in all, there is no other movement speed item in the game that beats Elusive Antlers. Red Whip gives you 30% on its first stack, and you have to stay out of combat, which means you can't use other abilities, and that's a green item. Yeah, I think Elusive Antlers earned its S tier spot right above Seed of Life. Growth Nectar grants 7% plus 7% per stack increase to all stats for each buff up to a maximum of 4 plus 4 per stack. It boosts your health, health regen, movement speed, damage, attack speed, crit chance, and armor. I think this might be the only red item that has movement speed buff. So Benthic Bloom runs are even better now. Love that for me. The old version required you to have 4 buffs at once. This one only requires you to have 1, meaning you can use it basically anytime, really. And each buff you have gives you 7% more stats, up to 28% for your first stack of growth nectar. And these stat increases are all multiplicative, which means that items like Soldier Syringe, which increases your attack speed by 15%, will actually be better when you have growth nectar. It's the same way Spinal Tonic works. This makes it one of the most synergistic items in the game, because unlike some things like prayer beads or just leveling up regularly, it increases all of your stats, even crit chance. So yeah, solid item, like my snake. S tier. Sail Star. Now, nothing changed about Sail Star. Literally untouched. Not even quality of life effects. Gain an extra item on the first chest open per stage. Each additional Sail Star increases the chance of getting more items by 5%. So the first Sail Star you get will guarantee double the amount of items you get from any chest. Small chest, adaptive chest, legendary chest, large chest, any chest, you will get +1 items from that chest. That doesn't mean it duplicates the item. It just means you get another chance for a different item. In the case of adaptive chest, though, whatever item you select from the adaptive chest will be duplicated. As for how it stacks, you can get a max amount of 5 extra items from a chest, and each Sail Star will give you more chances for extra items. And cool thing is, this is affected by luck, so if you have a 57-leaf clover, it's going to increase the chances that you get more items. The Sail Star is a great item, and it allows you to do a lot of different things. Sure, being able to use it for a legendary chest is always going to be smart, but let's say you want to have an equipment that you don't have. Using it on an equipment barrel gives you a whole bunch of different options. But let's be real, we're all just going to open it on the first chest we see because we forget that it exists. S for Sail Star. Next, we have Sonorous Whispers, again an untouched item. When a large monster is killed, it will always drop an item. All elites have a 4% chance of dropping an item, plus 1% per stack. Like Sail Star, this is affected by luck. And if an enemy is a boss and an elite type monster, it can drop 2 items. A large monster counts as basically anything that could be a boss. So the TP event is always going to drop items. A Beetle Queen that isn't spawned in by a teleporter, for example, is still going to drop an item. Scavengers drop items, Mithrix drops items, etc, etc. An interesting thing to use is the lunar item Defiant Gouge, which spawns enemies every time you use a shrine. Blood Shrine, Chance Shrine, any shrine. Because Defiant Gouge spawns enemies that are a higher difficulty than what you're currently at, it can often spawn boss enemies, which just gives you more items. Granted, you can kill them. That plus Shrine of the Mountain means you're going to get like 20 extra items each stage. Sonorous is just a great item with literally 0 downsides. You just kill boss enemies and get more items. The only downside is me getting annoyed that there's so many items on the ground. Next up, we have Unstable Transmitter. Another big glow up. Falling below 25% health gives you 75% of your maximum health as a temporary barrier. Gain a dimensional aura for 8 seconds that bleeds and teleports away enemies. Enemies killed by the aura extend the duration by 1 second, recharges every 45 seconds, minus 10% per stack. You can check out my Abuse This While You Can video. This explains more in detail why this item is so broken. But essentially, this item not only protects elixirs and delicate watches, because it gives you the shield before your items would break, it essentially gives you one-shot protection as long as this thing is off cooldown. So every 45 seconds, you effectively can't die from one shot. Also, because this is affected by Blast Shower, which at base only has a 20-second cooldown. So you cut the cooldown in half just by having that equipment. Unstable Transmitter is the best defensive item in the game. It makes it so you can't even die to fall damage in Eclipse. And really is the only way that you're able to get one-shot protection back in Eclipse after you take enough curse damage, of course. It's broken, it's busted, it'll save your delicate watches and your elixirs, on top of the 18 other defensive items we now have. But even as broken as this item is, it's still not the top. There's only one item that can keep the crown of the best item in the Seekers of the Storm DLC, and that item is Long-Standing Solitude, an item everybody thought was complete dog water, when in reality it was busted the whole time and still managed to get buffed. On level up, gain a free unlock for the next purchase, plus 1 free unlock per item stack, but all gold is converted to experience. Anything that costs gold is increased by 50%, plus 50% per item stack. What this means is that instead of being able to gain money, you have 0 gold now. All of your money is turned into XP, so you can level up fast as fuck, boy. Even without other money-making items like Brittle Crown, Roll of Pennies, Gore's Tome, even without those items, you can usually out-level the enemies, which is something unheard of in Risk of Rain 2. But with those items, you're definitely blazing past them and almost reaching max level before the end of the loop. The previous version would reset all of your stacks when you go to the next stage, kind of like Desperado. So even if you had 10 stacks and then went through the teleporter, on the next stage you would have 0. essentially making it so you'd have to be a lot smarter about when you were farming, so you could full loot the stage without wasting any of your free purchases. However, the buff made it so you don't have to worry about that anymore. It goes between stages. I've made a few videos about Longstanding Solitude before, and it's basically the same item, so you can check out the only real God Run and the new best item in the game if you want to see them played. Or if you want to see me try to prove that the item is really good, you can check out Ending the Debate, where I try my best to prove that Longstanding Solitude is absolutely broken by spawning in with Longstanding Solitude, which is the worst way to use this item. Because you have 0 gold, you're not able to use the Halcyon Shrine, which locks you out of a whole bunch of good items. And although you can still full loot without having any of the gold gaining items, it's going to be slightly slower. The real strength of the item comes from being able to get max level, so you end up having an insane amount of stats. As I've already talked about with prayer beads, stats are amazing. And again, Longstanding Solitude works with prayer beads, so you can get more value out of prayer beads as well. For example, in a typical run, if you're playing Commando, you might hit like level 35, let's say, which means you'll have about 96 damage from leveling up. Picking up a Longstanding Solitude and just getting to level 70, which by the way, you can definitely reach the max level by the second loop, which is level 94. But let's just say 70, you'll have 180 damage, nearly double, and you're still able to full loot everything. The only real downside of Longstanding Solitude is that sometimes it's a little difficult to get chance shrines. Every failed chance shrine actually counts towards your free purchase, so for some of those super annoying chance shrines, this could be a problem. The upside though is that you can use that free purchase on a legendary chest and get it immediately at the start of the stage. Shipping request forms also don't count, and getting a sales star just makes it more efficient. Honestly, if you're wondering why I think stats are so good and why I think prayer beads is a good item, pick up the Longstanding Solitude and see what happens when you start leveling up a lot. Another thing to mention about Longstanding Solitude is it's a lunar item, so you're basically signing a terms and agreement to pick up this item when you pick it up, and no one's forcing you to pick it up in the first place. Saying Longstanding Solitude isn't good because sometimes you can get hard lock in the Gilded Coast if you're not using your brain cells is like saying Gesture of the Drowned is a bad item because Recycler is hard to use when you pick up an optional lunar item. Long story short, Longstanding Solitude is the best item in the game, S tier plus, and that concludes our list. I don't think any of these items really change if you go to Eclipse, but I typically don't think too much about it unless it's like hyper obvious that it wouldn't work in Eclipse, because the average player probably doesn't play Eclipse, and an even smaller portion play with the hyper restrictive rules of don't loop, go straight to Mythics. So I'm trying not to factor that in too much to my list. Like I wouldn't say, oh, Sailstar isn't that good, because what if you get it at stage 5 right before you're about to go to Mythics? It wouldn't make sense because that's not going to happen in 99% of games. It would be like saying, sure, this item is good, but what if I don't use my mouse? How good is it then? So there we go. Compare this list to what I had before, and you'll notice a dramatic shift. Anyways, thanks for watching. SwagMoney69 signing out. Maybe like and subscribe.